Maria Chen observed the departure lounge of Chicago's International Airport with a mixture of impatience and irritation. Her designer handbag rested on the seat beside her, purposefully occupying space that could accommodate someone else. She had managed to get an upgrade to first class on her business trip to San Francisco, and the last thing she wanted was to share those precious flight hours with someone uninteresting. The VIP lounge was filled with well-dressed executives, all engrossed in their laptops and phones, and Maria felt perfectly at home in that environment of privilege and status. When the boarding announcement blared through the loudspeakers, Maria was one of the first to rise, straightening her Italian-tailored suit and checking her appearance in the reflection of a nearby window. She had worked hard to get where she was, a 38-year-old vice president of marketing at a cutting-edge technology company, and she made sure everyone around her recognized her. Success. Her hair was impeccably styled, her nails perfectly manicured, and every detail of her appearance screamed sophistication and corporate power. Upon boarding the plane, Maria greeted the flight attendant with a polite but distant smile, the kind of automatic courtesy that successful people offer to service providers. She located her seat in row 3, next to the window, and began to arrange her belongings with precise and efficient movements. The Boeing 787's first class was spacious and luxurious, with leather seats that converted into fully reclining beds, and Maria was already anticipating the 3 hours of tranquility she would have ahead to review her presentation. That's when she saw him. A young soldier, no more than 25, walked down the aisle carrying a worn military backpack and wearing his U.S. Army combat uniform. His face had that tired look of someone who had spent too much time away from home, and there was a recent scar above his left eyebrow. The soldier checked his boarding pass, and, to Maria's utter horror, began to approach row 3. Maria felt her stomach clench when she realized that the seat next to hers, the aisle seat, was exactly the soldier's destination. She watched as he carefully placed his backpack in the overhead compartment, as if each gesture required a conscious effort. When he prepared to sit down, Maria couldn't contain her reaction. She turned abruptly to the passing flight attendant and, in a tone loud enough for several people to hear, declared with indignation, evident in her voice that echoed through the first-class compartment. The flight attendant, a woman named Sandra with 20 years of aviation experience, stopped abruptly and looked at Maria with an expression that mixed surprise and barely disguised disapproval. The soldier, whose name was James Mitchell, froze mid-sitting, his face suddenly flushed with shame and embarrassment. A heavy silence fell over first class, and Maria could feel the disapproving stares of the other passengers, but her arrogance and sense of entitlement spoke louder than any notion of basic decency. Sandra took a deep breath, clearly making an effort to maintain her professional composure. She looked at James with an expression of genuine apology, then turned to Maria with a gaze that had cooled considerably. In a controlled but firm voice, Sandra explained that all seats had been properly assigned, and that there was no possibility of changing seats on that completely full flight. Maria opened her mouth to protest again, but something in Sandra's firm gaze made her hesitate. It was at that moment that a tall, gray-haired man rose from his seat in row 5. Richard Campbell was a retired Air Force general, now working as a defense consultant, and he had observed the entire scene with growing indignation. Without saying a word, he walked over to where James was still standing, clearly wishing the ground would swallow him up, and placed a firm but gentle hand on the young soldier's shoulder. In a voice that carried decades of military authority, Richard offered James his own first-class seat and said he would be honored if the soldier accepted. James tried to protest, saying it wasn't necessary, but Richard wouldn't accept a refusal. He picked up his own carry-on bag, and before James could argue further, was already guiding the young soldier to his previous seat. The expression on Richard's face as he passed Maria was one of utter disapproval, a look that made clear exactly what he thought of her behavior. Maria felt her face burn, but stubbornly kept her chin raised, refusing to show any regret. Richard settled into the seat next to Maria, and the atmosphere was so tense, it felt as if the air had become thicker. He didn't say a word to her, simply opened his book and began to read, but his silent presence was a constant reproach. Maria tried to concentrate on her laptop, but found the words on her screen blurring before her eyes. She could feel the gazes of other passengers, some discreet, others not so much, all laden with judgment. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Maria began to realize the magnitude of her mistake. She looked back and saw James sitting next to an elderly lady who was chatting animatedly with him, smiling and clearly interested in his story. Other first-class passengers had begun to greet James, some shaking his hand, others thanking him for his service. A well-dressed executive asked the flight attendant to send James a drink, and soon other passengers followed suit. Maria felt herself growing smaller and smaller in her seat. She had grown up in an upper-middle-class family in Boston, where financial success was the ultimate measure of a person's worth. Her parents, both successful doctors, had instilled in her from an early age the importance of associating only with people of the same social standing. She had attended elite private schools, graduated from an Ivy League university, and built an impressive career, rapidly climbing the corporate ladder. Somewhere along the way, she had confused professional success with human superiority. The flight continued in an uncomfortable silence for Maria. She tried to work, but her concentration was completely shattered. Every time a flight attendant passed by, Maria felt as if she were being judged, and probably was. Sandra, in particular, treated Maria with icy, professional courtesy, the bare minimum of service, without an ounce of human warmth. Meanwhile, Maria could hear laughter coming from the back of first class, where James was clearly getting along well with the other passengers. Richard finally broke the silence after an hour's flight. Without looking at Maria, he commented in a low but clear voice that he had served for 35 years in the armed forces and had known thousands of young people like James. Men and women who sacrificed their youth, their mental health, and sometimes their lives to protect the freedom of people like Maria, people who apparently lacked the basic decency to show respect for that sacrifice. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made Maria feel as if she had been physically struck. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She wasn't used to being confronted, much less being put in her place so directly and deservedly. For the first time in years, Maria was forced to truly reflect on who she had become. When had she started judging people by the cut of their clothes instead of the content of their character? When had she become so consumed by status and appearances that she had lost all sense of basic humanity and respect? The rest of the flight passed in a kind of silent agony for Maria. She refused the meal the flight attendant offered, her stomach too churned to think about food. Through the gap between the seats, she occasionally caught sight of James, who seemed to have completely forgotten the initial incident and was engrossed in lively conversation with other passengers. The elderly lady next to him was showing photos of what appeared to be her family, and James was smiling genuinely, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes and lights up the whole face. As the plane began its descent to San Francisco, Maria made a decision. She couldn't undo what she had done, couldn't erase the cruel words she had spoken, or the embarrassment she had caused a young man who had done nothing but serve his country. But perhaps she could begin to make amends. Perhaps she could use this as a moment of real transformation, instead of simply burying her shame and moving on as if nothing had happened. After landing, Maria waited deliberately, letting other passengers disembark first. She saw James stand up, profusely thank General Campbell for his kindness, and begin to make his way down the aisle. Maria quickly grabbed her bag and followed him, catching up with him in the terminal, before he could disappear into the crowd. In a slightly trembling voice, she asked for a moment of his time. James turned, surprised, and Maria saw the caution in his eyes, a reminder of the earlier embarrassment. She swallowed her pride, something she wasn't used to, and offered a sincere and unreserved apology. She admitted that she had behaved shamefully, that there was no excuse for her cruelty, and that she deeply regretted treating him with such disrespect. Maria explained that she wasn't seeking absolution, but simply wanted him to know that she recognized the seriousness of her actions. James remained silent for a long moment, and Maria could see various emotions crossing his face. Finally, with a grace Maria wasn't sure she possessed in her position, he accepted her apology. He explained briefly that he had just returned from an 18-month tour of duty in Afghanistan, where he had served as a combat medic, saving lives under enemy fire. The upgrade to first class had been an unexpected surprise from the airline, a small gesture of appreciation for his service, and he had been thrilled with the experience up to that initial moment. Maria felt a new wave of shame upon hearing this. While she worried about PowerPoint presentations and sales quotas, this young man had risked his life daily to save others. While she boasted of her success in executive meetings, he had held the hands of wounded soldiers and comforted those facing their final moments. The disparity between their contributions to the world was so stark that Maria could barely process it. Before they could part ways, Maria did something completely out of character for her. She asked for James's full name and inquired if she could stay in touch. Not to alleviate her own guilt, she clarified, but because something about that encounter had fundamentally shaken her perspective, and she felt there was a greater lesson she needed to learn. James, with a mixture of surprise and curiosity, agreed and exchanged contact information with her. In the weeks that followed, Maria found herself constantly thinking about that flight. Her presentation in San Francisco had been a resounding success, securing a multi-million-dollar contract for her company, but the victory felt empty. She began to question the priorities she had set for her life, the values she had unquestioningly absorbed from her privileged upbringing. Maria began researching organizations that supported veterans, particularly those focused on mental health and reintegration into civilian life. Maria contacted James a few weeks later, not with a condescending attitude of charity, but with genuine humility and a desire to better understand the world he and other veterans navigated. James, who was facing his own challenges adjusting to civilian life after years of active service, appreciated the genuine outreach. They began meeting occasionally for coffee, conversations that opened Maria's eyes to realities she had never considered. Through James, Maria met other veterans, each with their own stories of sacrifice and service. She heard about the post-traumatic stress that haunted many even years after leaving active service, about the difficulties of finding meaningful employment in a civilian market that often failed to recognize or value their unique skills, about broken marriages and strained relationships caused by prolonged absences and unprocessed trauma. It was a world completely different from what she knew, and the exposure was profoundly transformative. Maria began using her position and resources in ways she had never considered before. She initiated a veteran recruitment program at her company, working personally with the Human Resources Department to create career paths that recognized and valued the leadership, discipline, and problem-solving skills that veterans brought. She established a scholarship fund for children of active duty military personnel, directing a significant percentage of her own salary to the cause. But more important than any financial or professional contribution was the fundamental shift in how Maria viewed the people around her. She began to truly see the individuals she had previously categorized and dismissed based on superficial appearances. The barista who made her coffee every morning wasn't just a service provider, but an engineering student working to pay for his education. The cleaning lady in her office building wasn't invisible, but a courageous immigrant building a better life for her family in a foreign country. Maria shared her story at a women's leadership conference 6 months after the plane incident. She spared no detail in describing her own shameful behavior, using her experience as a powerful example of how professional success without humanity and humility is hollow and destructive. Her brutal honesty resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom recognized in her story their own moments of arrogance and lack of compassion. The video of her talk went viral, reaching millions of views and sparking conversations about privilege, respect, and true success. The relationship between Maria and James evolved into a genuine friendship, built not on guilt or obligation, but on mutual respect and shared values. James eventually accepted a position at Maria's company, working in logistics operations where his military skills were perfectly suited. He became an advocate for hiring veterans, frequently speaking about the competitive advantages veterans bring to civilian organizations. 2 years after that fateful flight, Maria was at a fundraising event for a veterans organization she had helped establish. General Richard Campbell was there too, now a member of the organization's board. When their eyes met across the room, he nodded approvingly, a silent acknowledgement of the journey she had undertaken. Maria felt a surge of gratitude, not only for his intervention that day on the plane, but for having become an informal mentor as she navigated her own process of growth and change. Maria's transformation did not go unnoticed in her professional and personal circles. Some colleagues viewed her new priorities with skepticism, questioning whether her focus on social causes might affect her professional performance. But Maria discovered that the opposite was true. Her leadership became more effective because it was rooted in genuine empathy and respect for people. Her team responded with increased loyalty and dedication because they felt valued as whole human beings, not just human resources. Maria's story eventually reached the ears of her company's senior management, and instead of criticism, she found support. The CEO, himself a Vietnam veteran, was impressed by her honesty and commitment to change. He promoted her to senior vice president, and tasked her with leading a company-wide corporate social responsibility initiative, expanding the model she had created for hiring and supporting veterans to other underserved communities. Maria never forgot the lesson of that day on the plane, that moment of public shame that had become the catalyst for the most significant change in her life. She kept a photo of James in uniform on her desk, not as a trophy of his redemption, but as a constant reminder that a person's true worth can never be measured by titles, clothes, or airplane seats. It was measured, character, service, and a willingness to acknowledge and learn from one's own mistakes.